Like hockey, soccer is a game that in many ways seems tailor-made for video game structure. Since every position has its own designated zone, and otherwise the game essentially boils down to running, passing, and shooting. Soccer games, since the beginning of time, pretty much have that same structure. All you really need is a sprint button, a pass button, a kick button, and a clear view of the pitch, so you can plan out your moves to put it in the back of the net. What Sega AM2, the developers of the Virtua Striker series, started asking is how much you would enjoy it if, you couldn't see most of the field, and your entire ability to know where your teammates are is a tiny graph of colored dots that's way at the bottom, nearly impossible to process at a glance. But great news, you also can't sprint, so the computer is on you non-stop while you don't know where anyone is. Doesn't that sound fun? No, it doesn't. Sega AM2 was a division that was devoted to pushing hardware specs forward, a team making the most graphically impressive games they could conjure. In the summer of 1992, when arcade racing games mostly looked like cartoons, AM2 put out a groundbreaking computer graphics-based arcade game called Virtua Racer. It was a huge hit for its new graphical capabilities, and that enthusiasm carried over to the following year, when the same team worked in tandem with Lockheed Martin to develop a polygonal fighting game under the same umbrella, called Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter was an absolute sensation, as people gathered far and wide to marvel at the visuals. They couldn't believe the professional sheen and the complex motion animation. The following year, they tried their hand at a sports game, a soccer game called Virtua Striker. Knowing this context, it makes sense that we're so ridiculously close to the action, because visuals were their job. The graphical achievement would be on the forefront of their minds. Virtua Striker was also a huge hit, but all the positive criticism I can find mostly just talks about how cool it looks. How it played seemed almost immaterial. Virtua Striker was so visually complex that it had no chance being ported to the home systems of 1994. Even the brand new 32-bit consoles like the PlayStation or Sega's own Saturn without major concessions. So Virtua Striker is instead a rare sports title that exists entirely and exclusively on arcade machines. The team instead focused on Virtua Striker 2, which released in Japanese arcades in the spring of 1997. It was also a huge hit, and they kept tinkering and putting out updated versions through 1998 and 1999, culminating in the somewhat confusingly titled Virtua Striker 2 version 2000.1. By 1999, home console tech had advanced far enough that it could be ported to the Sega Dreamcast. But, while the character models are impressive, in a situation reminiscent of Soul Fighter, that slavish devotion to graphical fidelity means that the actual gameplay truly falls by the wayside. Virtua Striker 2 is as immediately frustrating as any sports game I have ever played. And as I've discussed on here, sports games are my primary forte of the last quarter century in gaming. I started playing this game and felt like I wanted to rip my hair out 2 minutes in. And that feeling did not even slightly subside during any time I dropped in over the next month that I played it. It really is like Soul Fighter, in that the graphics do genuinely look nice. But everything else is just the fucking worst. Let me just read directly from my notes, just to make sure I'm properly capturing my direct, active mindset at the time I was fully immersed in this game. And I quote, "I can't get any shots off, I can't keep the ball, there's no sprint button. The computer, even on easy, is absolutely everywhere that the ball is at all times. There's no way to zoom out to be able to see who the you're passing to. I didn't get my first actual shot on goal until more than 35 minutes through my playthrough. Didn't make a goal, just got a fucking shot off." End quote. The buttons are so bare bones that there's nothing to do about these issues, no options to switch through, no strategy you can take to adjust. This isn't exaggerated arcade excitement. This isn't some simplified, amplified take on the sport. It's just the sport, but way worse. The controls here are so broken and inexact, and the angle you're forced to play at is so poor, that I decided to try just putting it on 2-player mode, just to try and practice without relentless competition. Because the game, of course, doesn't have any sort of training or practice mode. And even then, it still took me nearly 10 full minutes to score a goal, without any active opposition. Just an insanely broken system. Back on the Trick Style episode, I discussed how that game sucked because its developers were so minutely focused on perfecting the physics of the hoverboards used in races, to the detriment and neglect of every other facet of the game. The tracks felt carelessly designed, the expected metrics were needlessly cruel and restrictive, and the structure just didn't make much sense. Virtua Striker 2 feels much the same. You can't see your teammates, so you can't strategize game plans. The little map is impossible to process conveniently. The clock is in an awkward place, and so dark I never noticed until time was expiring. Just a bunch of careless little things that could have been adjusted or hammered out if it had ever been prioritized. But as it stands, this is a game that is nice to look at, but absolute hell to try and play. And the announcer yelling at deafening volumes when the omniscient other team perfectly navigates away from you takes Virtua Striker 2 from a never play situation to a break the disc one. Next time, we've got a grumpy man with a big sword and a tiny, wisecracking pixie. And they're just absolutely covered in blood. What's not to like?